So the fountain of youth, it's been something sought after for centuries. People looking for a way to live forever, to enjoy that quality and quantity of life. And in our modern age, we have lots of technology, right? Certainly there are many branches of medicine that seek to create perhaps longer life. And if they can't create longer life, at least create the facade, right, of longer life. With all of this talk in my country about healthcare and the revamping of healthcare and what's going to be paid for, what's not going to be paid for, one branch of medicine has not suffered at all. Did you know that? Plastic surgery is still booming in my country and around the world. People have great demand to not only undergo the procedures, but the Botox, dermatology is booming as well. People are wanting that younger look. And certainly you may say, well, you know, I would never do plastic surgery. That's a waste of means and time and whatever. But, well, maybe you dye your hair, though, wouldn't you? So there's certainly something that people can resonate with. They want to look the way they looked when they were younger. Perhaps you don't dye your hair, but maybe a little makeup, you know, to make yourself look younger. Or more vibrant or more alive and things like that. But maybe you say, I would never use makeup, but you're looking for the right food to keep you living longer, right? Perhaps you've bought Tahitian noni or mangosteen or something like that in an effort to live longer, to find that magic bullet, that magic supplement, that magic herb that's going to get me to where I need to be health-wise. Isn't it true that we all, in some way or another, are looking for better health? However, in spite of our best efforts, all of us seem to follow the same path. In fact, if you think about it long enough, it can be quite depressing. If we didn't know the Lord, right? Praise God, that's right. Now, if you consider for a moment the human body, one of my favorite organs is the brain. I enjoy studying the brain because I believe that in the brain we find the clearest evidence of our design. You know, Daniel and I were talking about the memory on different laptops, and because Daniel does all the recording, right? He does all the editing for these camp meetings. He needs a very large amount of memory on his laptop. I think you said 4 terabytes or something like that, some humongous amount of memory on your laptop, because that laptop is designed for movie editing, things like that. However, if you look at our brain and you look at the hard drive, right? How much of the hard drive do you think we manage to fill in an entire lifetime? Any thoughts? What percentage would you say? 1%. Interesting. 1%. It's a little bit more than 1%. But that's certainly a thought. Any other thoughts? 10%? Okay. Very low guesses. 50%? Okay. Anything else? The average is probably close to about 4 or 5%. Does that seem strange to you? Those who are geniuses or super geniuses, the Albert Einsteins, the Schweitzers of our race, manage to fill about 7 or 8%. But doesn't that strike you as odd? That we only manage to fill 7% at the most of our brains. What does that tell you about the design for the hard drive? It was designed for what? Much, much longer. Yes, forever. So if you think about our brains, just from an anatomical and physiological standpoint, there is a clear design for longevity. Much, much longer than the average lifespan, which is high 70s, early 80s, depending on the country you look at. My country, it's 79. Yours is about the same. But I believe if you look at the human body itself, not just the brain, there's many other examples which we don't have time for today. But I believe, I agree with you, that we were designed not just to live to 79, not 99, not 100, not even 1,000, but forever. I believe the design is very clear in the human body that we were designed for so much more than the average lifespan. So let's take a look. We're going to examine 3 people groups today that live the longest. Perhaps some of you have seen the magazine National Geographic. Anyone seen that magazine? There was a very interesting expose that they did on longevity, and we're going to examine that article today. The first place that we're going to travel to is Okinawa, Japan. Has anyone been to Japan? I think I'm the only person. I have been to Japan several times, and Japan is a series of islands. Okinawa is an island off the south coast of Japan, and it's home to a very, very long-lived race. The Okinawans versus myself, versus an American, they live much, much longer than we do. The men live to 78, the women live to 86. Now that may not seem very high to you, but that is almost 3 years longer than the average in my country or even your country. So it actually is quite significant. They have only 20% of the heart disease, 25% of the breast and prostate cancers, which, by the way, are the big cancers for Seventh-day Adventists. Did you know that? We don't get lung cancer as much as the general population. Why would you think that? Well, we don't smoke, yes. But prostate and breast cancer are really big issues for us. And I'll let you think about why that may be. We'll talk about that perhaps a little bit later. The Okinawans also have a plant-based diet, and I really appreciated what Jonathan mentioned, is that they all have something that's called ikigai. Now, the word ikigai translates in Japanese to the reason for which you get up in the morning. Or it's your purpose in life, it's your drive, it's your inspiration. And I'm glad Jonathan talked about that, because that's a very important component of longevity. Elder Spear had a purpose, right? He was preaching until he was in his 90s. And so he had a reason to get up in the morning. He had a reason for being and doing. And that is definitely a component in longevity. We have Fumiyasu, who is 84, and his ikigai is the decathlon. His favorite event? The pole vault. True story. The Okinawans also have their own gardens. They grow their own food, but amazingly enough, they eat more but weigh less. How is that possible? Well, they eat a lot of plant-based foods, tofu, veggies, cauliflower, carrots, things that are very high in nutrition and high in volume, but very low in calories. Serie Toguchi is 104 years old, and here we see him enjoying several components of longevity. He is getting not only exercise in his garden, but he's getting fresh air, he's getting vitamin D, right? And he's also enjoying a little nap at the same time. Now, they asked him, they said, Mr. Toguchi, what about the red gloves? How does that play into longevity? He said, oh, they're just easy to find. The Okinawans also have a word called a moai. All Okinawans belong to a moai, and the translation for that word in Japanese is it's a group of people who go through life together and help one another. Now, the problem is in Western societies, we all are independent atoms. Have you noticed that? We all want our own place. You know, we don't want to be close to our relatives, right? You've noticed that that's a little bit different than kind of the Okinawan way. They have not only close family ties, but they have close ties with their friends. A moai will get together at least 3 times a week. And they will help each other, not just socially, but even economically, spiritually, professionally. They will help one another. Unfortunately, Okinawa is starting to lose its longevity edge as Westernization marks the end of all societies. The golden arches, right? Because, of course, they're moving away now from their traditional diets of growing their own foods, and now they're eating more fast foods and things that are higher in saturated fat, cholesterol, and animal proteins. Our next trip will be to Europe, to Sardinia, Italy. Sardinia is also an island off the coast of Italy, and it is home to an amazing group of people. In Sulanus, which is a village in Sardinia, we find Tonino, who is a shepherd at 75. He works from dawn to dusk, repairing fences, herding sheep, cutting wood, and he never stops all day long. The Sardinians are very much a fanatic for the family. Every week, they have a giant meal with the entire immediate and extended family where the patriarch always presides. This particular patriarch is 103 years old. They also have found in Sardinia, there's an interesting phenomenon. Typically, who lives longer, men or women? Women, yes, by about 5, 6, or even 8 years longer, depending on the data that you look at. But in Sardinia, men live just as long as women. Isn't that amazing? Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. What they've found is that women take on a lot more responsibility in that society, so men have less stress. So they've found that the typical centenarian, or those who live to 100, ratio is there's 4 women who make it to 100 for every 1 man, but in Sardinia it's 1 to 1. Very interesting concept. I think that that's something we can learn from. They have a very active outdoor life, but some people have thought that perhaps geography helps. It is more of a rural society. It is also an island as well, just like Okinawa. Giuseppe illustrates that it is an attitude that may give you longevity as well. Giuseppe at 85 is still working strong. Of course, we hope that you don't eat what he's catching, right? But they interviewed Giuseppe, and they said, aren't you ever tired? I mean, why do you get up and work? I mean, you're 85, you don't need to do that. I mean, if you're feeling tired or down, why don't you just stay home and rest? And his philosophy was, if I stayed home, I would be sick. Now, isn't that funny? That's kind of the reverse of some of our thinking. We think, well, if you're feeling sick, you stay home, right? But that's not the way they think. They think if you stay home, then you'll get sick. Sardinia also has some nutritional advantages. They have found that the grapes on the island have 300% of the resveratrol and quercetin. Those are 2 very powerful antioxidant compounds found in white and red grapes. Also, they found that the island of Sardinia is what we call a genetic incubator, meaning that 80% of the inhabitants of the island are directly related to the original founders of that island. So a lot of people have criticized the literature about Sardinia, saying that, well, you know, they just have really good genes because they're all related to each other. And if the first person had good longevity genes, then everyone is going to have that. Also, they criticize it because there's only about 2,500 of them. So what conclusions can you really make about just 2,500 people? Also, the Sardinians are losing their edge just like the Okinawans. Obesity affects 10% of them. Now, that may not seem very high to you, but in the last few decades, previous to that, they had a 0% obesity rate. To give you a perspective, in my country, 36% of the population is obese. Your country is not as bad. It's a little bit, it's like about 30, a little less than 30% actually. So they are starting to lose their edge as well. However, I don't live out in the country, right? I don't have my own garden. I don't belong to an island community. My ancestors didn't live to be 100. Do I have a chance of making it at all? Well, as a matter of fact, you do. That's our next visit. We're going to sunny Loma Linda, California, where we're going to meet a group of happy and healthy seniors. How do they do it? Well, let's examine our champion. Marge Chaton, she passed away, by the way, recently at 106, by the way. She was married to a physician. He lived to 98, so both of them lived a long, long time. This is her when she turned 100. She does not live in the country, right? She does not have her own garden, and here she is filling up her car, still driving at 100 years old. That's pretty amazing. She renewed her driver's license for 5 years after this picture. This is Dr. Shearer, the longest lived water skier on the planet. At 100 years of age, still kicking up the sprays, and he has outlived the average physician by several decades. This is one of my professors in medical school. At 91, Dr. Wareham was still performing heart surgery, if you can believe that. And people were not worried about him. He did not have a tremor. He was very steady-handed. He was very sharp and intelligent. I remember meeting him, a wonderful, godly man. Of course, our third group, as you all know, are the Seventh-day Adventists. Lydia Newton, at the time of this article, was 112 years old, and at that moment was among the top 20 longest-lived people on the planet. Do we have longevity because of our good genes? Is it divine intervention? Well, the author of the article said good genes God may or may not have something to do with it, but their religion does. Well, let's examine that. There's about 20 million of us. We're all around the world. We don't live on one island, right? We're everywhere. We come from every race, every culture, and many of us are not isolated or in the country, although we should be, right? We come from every walk of life, and our common bond is our religion and our lifestyle. Well, it should be our common bond. We'll learn about that. So if you take the best of all worlds, you look at Sardinia, you look at Okinawa and the Seventh-day Adventists, it's all plant-based diets. We don't smoke or drink. We're all family-oriented, and we all have, or should have, daily physical activity. Anyone ever heard of Newsweek? Newsweek, yes. It's a fairly common publication in my country. This is from April 2011. And this is a flow chart of how to live forever. Now, I'm not going to show you the whole flow chart. You can look it up yourself. The reference is up there. But it's very intriguing. You notice that the third step after birth is you are what? A Seventh-day Adventist. I find that very intriguing. That a secular publication is identifying a religious affiliation as related to longevity. I mean, there's a lot of things I could talk about this. I don't know if you can see this, the corner, but it says you started formal schooling after age 6. Do you realize that following our message of homeschooling is not just good for your mind, but it makes you live longer now? I think that's pretty cool. But of course, that's another lecture. U.S. News and World Reports. Anyone heard about that? Big secular publication. This is from 2012, and they published the 11 health habits that will help you live to 100 years old. I certainly hope that we all live not only to 100, but forever. But here are the things that they identified. I think they'll sound very familiar to you. Number 1, those who retire expire. So, in other words, don't stop doing what your passion is. As Jonathan pointed out, keep preaching until you're 90. I can tell you that in my profession, I deal with a lot of the geriatric or the older population. And they are in 2 different groups. One group is my patients. They're in the gurney. The other group of old people are pushing the gurneys. Who are those people? Yeah, the volunteers, right? They're seniors that have kept active in their older years. So one of the things I would say to all of you is even if you quit your formal job, continue being active. Volunteer, teach, keep your mind engaged. That's very, very important to have not only activity but purpose and meaning. as Jonathan was mentioning. Number 2 may surprise you, but they found that if you floss, you live longer. Isn't that weird? Now, anyone, can you think of why that might help you? Yes. What? Go ahead.
Chewing. What about chewing?
Yeah, it is chewing, but this is flossing. I'm talking about flossing.
Decay.
Flossing. Go ahead.
It actually reduces the decay on your teeth, but actually leaving a plaque.
It does, but there's something even more related to that. I'll give you a hint. Have you noticed that when you floss, after not flossing for a long time, what happens to your gums? They bleed. Have you noticed that? Now, the reason why they bleed is because when you don't floss, your gums become inflamed. You get something called gingivitis. I don't know if you've heard of that. But your gums become inflamed, and that inflammation allows the bacteria in your mouth to go into the bloodstream. And once it enters the bloodstream, they've actually found that those bacteria can start inflammation in the coronary arteries. Those are the arteries that supply your heart. Amazing, but true. So flossing actually increases your longevity. Now, if you interviewed the author of the article on the flossing and longevity, he believes that flossing twice a day is actually optimal, but the data didn't quite reach what we call statistical significance. It only was significant once a day. Interestingly enough, brushing your teeth didn't make you live longer, but it's nice to have fresh breath, right? So certainly I'm not against brushing your teeth, especially if you're like right next to me or something like that. So flossing is important for longevity, not only for your teeth, but for your health in general. Number 3 is probably my favorite. There is nothing that's closer to the fountain of youth than exercise. When you look at what are called meta-analyses, and a meta-analysis is a study that takes hundreds of studies and summarizes them and boils them down into one study. When you look at meta-analyses on exercise, one of my favorite summary statements was this one. When you exercise, you can count on every hour that you exercise, living that hour over again, and 2 or 3 more hours on top of it. So that is almost 400% on your investment. Anyone make 400% on their money? If you do, talk to me afterwards, because I'd like to learn what you're doing. But 400% on your investment, that's tremendous. So when you exercise, don't think about it as wasting your time, because you're going to get that time back and 2 or 3 times more on top of it. A lot of people will ask me and they say, well, what kind of exercise should I do? Well, whatever you will do. That's what I tell people. Because there's lots of focus in on the type of exercise. When we find in the medical literature, the biggest issue is that people don't exercise. It's not the type or duration or intensity. Just do it. That's what I tell people. And it's not just the general population. It's Seventh-day Adventists too. Our Achilles heel in the Adventist Health Study is exercise. Did you know that? Less than 10% of us exercise daily. Less than 10%. Right? I mean, more than that are vegetarians. I mean, we're doing better in that area. Whereas I feel like, yes?
You do a physical job then. Do you class that as exercise?
A lot of times they've found when they do interviews with people on exercise, when they have them fill out a questionnaire, how much exercise do you think you do? When people have physical jobs, they tend to over-report how active they are. So I tell people you can count that, but if you really want to say it, because some people say, well, I walk 15 miles at work a day. Well, wear a pedometer and prove that. That's what I would say, is that if you do have a physical job, that's fine. I think that's great. But don't think that that's just enough, because they've found that people tend to overestimate their amount of physical activity if they have a physical job. But certainly it'd be great. I would love to have a physical job. Mine is mostly mental. It's probably more active than most physicians, but I don't count my work as physical activity. I'll do my 10 kilometers of cardio every day on top of that. Yeah.
Says if you do some physical exercise with a purpose.
Yes.
Or let the clock
Absolutely. Exactly. I think having a purpose engages not only your body, but it engages your mind. It engages your will. And that's where the ikigai, right, remember? That's where the ikigai factor comes in, is that you actually have a purpose in life, rather than just running on a treadmill, right, or something like that. Certainly, I think it's important to garden, to do construction or whatever, but don't let the fact that you have the purpose replace the actual aerobic component of it. Don't think that just working in your garden is sufficient, especially if you're a young person. If you're a young person, you need a lot more intense exercise, a lot more vigorous exercise. But certainly, my favorite exercise growing up was chopping wood. It's got a purpose, right? And it's very hard. It's very intense, very vigorous. I think that's phenomenal. So yes, you're right. Having purpose and engaging your mind gives you double the benefit, because it not only gives you the physical benefit, it gives you the mental and emotional and spiritual benefit as well. So as far as exercise, I tell people, don't worry about getting your heart rate up to so much. Don't worry about intensity. Don't worry about all this other stuff, because what they found is initially they were recommending 3 times a week, an hour a day, 3 times a week. But then they looked at the medical literature and they wanted to look at 4 times a week versus 3 times a week. And which one do you think people live longer in? 4 times a week. Then they looked at 5 times a week. They looked at 5 times a week versus 4 times a week. But of course, when they made it 5 times a week, they reduced the amount of time each day. They kept the time the same, the total time. So which do you think was better, 5 days a week or 4 days a week? Yes, you lived longer. Then they looked at 6 days a week. 6 days a week versus 5 days a week of physical activity and exercise. Which group lived longer? 6 days a week. Then they looked at 7 days a week, right? 7 days a week of physical activity versus 6 days a week. Which group lived longer? There was no difference, actually. There was no difference. Now, consider the 4th commandment. What is the 4th commandment about? Well, it's not just about rest, it's about work, isn't it? Because with the commandment to rest, there is a command to how many days a week? Coincidence? I think not. Right? So we find that God Himself has designed our frequency of exercise. Right? He says 6 days a week, do what? Your work and your labor, right? But then you take a break, how often? That's right. But how often does society take a break? Well, 2 days a week, right? We have weekends, right? Those are 2 days a week. Now, have you ever thought about the most miserable day of the week? What is it? Mondays, right? We call them miserable Mondays. But why are they miserable? Have you thought about that? Why is Monday the most miserable day of the week? Tell me. Yes, exactly. But I'm going to share with you the physiological reason why you hate Mondays. There's an actual physiological reason. When you think about Monday, right before Monday, you've just had the weekend, right? So your schedule during the week is regular for most people that have jobs, right? Monday through Friday they work. Then Friday night they party like an animal and they, are hungover or they sleep in late Saturday. And then Saturday night they party like an animal and they sleep in late. And then Sunday they go, oh no, I got to get ready to go to work, right? So then they try to turn things around for Monday. But do you know what a circadian rhythm is? Have you heard of that? Your circadian rhythm is your sleep-wake cycle. And your circadian rhythm is what was basically messed up for me when I came over here to England, right, from Seattle, because the time zones are totally off. But you begin to acclimate. So when you have a schedule, what they have found is your body can tolerate 1 day of change in the circadian rhythm without switching to that rhythm. So in other words, if you only have 1 day that's different, your body is okay. But if you have 2 days of the same schedule, then your body begins to adapt. Does that make sense? Now, are you starting to think of why Mondays are so miserable? You know, during World War II, when we were basically fighting for our lives, both the United States and England and many other countries, they improved and increased the output of their factories for the war effort. And they found initially that when they did 7 days a week, it actually wasn't good. There were more accidents, there was more sickness and things like that. Then they backed it back down to 5 days a week, and they didn't have enough supplies, and they found that the perfect, ideal production versus safety was what? 6 days a week, absolutely. That was done actually in this country. Did you know that? 6-day work week is what they instituted, and they found that was actually the most ideal. And now the reason for the miserable Mondays is because you've kept the same schedule on Saturday and Sunday, and so your body is starting to adapt. So what I would recommend is that on Sabbath you have that change in schedule, but Sunday you do what? Get up at the same time, right? A lot of people say, wow, it's my only chance to sleep in, but I promise you is if you sleep in on Sunday, then you're going to have the miserable Monday, because your body will start to adapt to that schedule again, and it has horrible consequences for your health. What's the most important meal today? Breakfast. But it's not just that you eat breakfast, it's that you eat a large breakfast. And what they found is that if you eat a fiber-rich cereal, that you will live longer, because it affects your blood sugar levels. Not just for that meal, but they found it affects it for the entire day. Did you know that if you eat breakfast, you will lose weight if you're overweight? Did you know that? That doesn't seem to make sense, does it? If you add a meal, why would adding a meal make you lose weight? Because what meal do most people skip? Breakfast, right? So why would adding a meal make you lose weight? What do you think? Less snacking. What else? Ah, that's right. What they found is when you eat a large breakfast, you actually jumpstart your metabolism for the rest of the day. Did you know that? If you eat breakfast, your metabolism is 25% higher than if you skip breakfast, because your body is setting the rhythm for the day in the morning. So what I recommend to people is eat a large breakfast, whole grain cereals, and you will have a higher metabolism for the rest of the day. Also, what you said is true, is those calories you eat in the morning, those are going to be used for energy. They're not going to be used for storage on the spare tire, right? You don't want to do that. You want to take your calories and use them for what they were designed for. Work, right? Productivity, energy, physical exertion. Number 5 is a big one for physicians, and that's sleep. Sleeping is very, very important. In fact, what they have found is if you don't sleep enough, you can't lose weight, even if you exercise and diet. And the reason for that is because of cortisol. Have you heard of cortisol? If your cortisol levels are off, if your hormonal levels are off, you cannot lose weight, even with diet or exercise. But sleep actually regulates your hormones. Did you know that? Sleep is what kind of resets everything. It allows you to repair and things like that. But it's not just the quantity, but the quality, right? Because if you're constantly waking up, if there's noise, if there's light, then that's a problem. What I do as I travel, of course, a lot, and I'm often in people's homes, and people's schedules are not necessarily regular, and they may have little children or something like that, is I wear pairs of custom-made silicone earplugs. So I pop those in, and I can't hear you talking to me at all. Like if you're in front of me, you'll be like this. So I tell you that those are very important to me, but I also have a sleep mask. Now the reason I do that is because if you think about the original design, at night it's designed to be dark. Does that make sense? There's not street lights and things like that. And if you think about before artificial lighting, when did people go to bed? Well, shortly after the sun went down. Because otherwise, if you wanted to stay awake past sunset, what would you have to do? Yes, you'd have to waste your candles or your fuel, right? And so why would you do that if you could avoid it? So people in general went to bed shortly after it was dark. And then when did they get up? Yes, exactly. So this artificial lighting, right? This is all really bad for us because it's not part of our original design. So if you're going to sleep, what I recommend is you sleep earlier, right? We all know the quote that 2 hours good sleep before midnight is worth more than 4 hours of sleep after midnight. Now, the reason that's true is due to a hormone called melatonin. Have you heard of melatonin? There's melatonin, there's serotonin, there's cortisol, things like that. So those things are definitely related to longevity. In fact, they have found that melatonin is perhaps the fountain of youth. If you can enhance your body's what we call endogenous melatonin production, you can live forever. It actually affects things called telomeres. Does anyone know what telomeres are? Telomeres, who knows what telomeres are? Did someone actually say yes? No? I'd be shocked if you knew what telomeres were. But telomeres are like, who has shoelaces on right now? Have you noticed what's on the end of your shoelaces? The little plastic. And what are those for? Yeah, stop it from frying and unraveling. Telomeres are like the plastic ends of your chromosomes to keep them from unraveling. Does that make sense? Your chromosomes, your DNA, your genetic code, things like that. The telomeres protect your genetic information. And if those start to weaken, then you get genetic damage. So melatonin is related to telomere health. And of course, lifestyle, they've found, can enhance and even repair your telomeres, which is pretty amazing. So when we look at sleep, that's very, very important. Don't just say, well, you know what? I'm going to just party like a fiend and then I'll catch up, right? Have you heard that? People will just catch up on the weekend. But they found that you cannot catch up. They've actually done experiments on sleep deprivation. You can only recover 1/3 of your lost sleep. So in other words, if you, like me, only slept for 4 hours the first day I arrived here, not because I wanted to, but because I was just like awake really early and I couldn't go back to sleep. So if you only slept for 4 hours, you were deficient by about 4 hours, right? So let's say the next day I tried to sleep more. I can only make up 1/3 of those 4 hours that I missed. You've already kind of done the damage. There are other things that affect your melatonin production as well. And it's not necessarily sleep related. Have you ever wondered why we're not supposed to drink caffeine? Have you thought about that? I mean, Ellen White doesn't really give a lot of reasons. She says it's a stimulant, right? But we all know that, right? But we're starting to discover what caffeine does. Did you know that if you drink just a single serving caffeinated beverage, and I'm talking about just 50 milligrams of caffeine, typical soda has 50 milligrams of caffeine. I know, you're going to have to listen to it. So if you have just one serving of a caffeinated beverage, that you cut your melatonin production in half for 3 days. Most people aren't aware of that literature, but that's just coming out now. So imagine for a moment if you just drank 1 cup of coffee twice a week. Do you realize you're living on half of your melatonin production all the time? Does that make sense? You drink 1 serving, you cut it in half for 3 days, you drink another serving, and that's another 3 days. So your body doesn't recover quickly. Because some people say, yeah, I drink caffeine, but it doesn't affect me. You may not think it affects you, but the data does not lie. You have an effect on your hormone production that's long-term for 3 days, right? Then how many people just have 2 servings of caffeinated beverage a week? right? I mean, typically it's at least once a day, right? So these people are at a quarter of their melatonin production, or maybe even an eighth of their melatonin production. So they find a lot of that leads to premature aging. So drinking those beverages, the caffeinated products, chocolate, things like that, is not just affecting your health from a stimulant standpoint, it's destroying your longevity potential because it's crippling your melatonin production. Did I create some conviction? That's good. The silicone earplugs, yes. Number 6 is eat whole foods. Now, obviously, that makes sense, right? The nearer the vine, the greater the blessing. That's the quote, right? So the best food is in its most natural environment. So this whole stuff with GMO and pesticides and whatever, organic, did you know organic was just regular food just 50 years ago? All food was organic back then. So that is the best way to get it, not something that's like been sitting around forever. The best way to eat something is just go, right? That's the best way to eat it. Just fresh from the tree or the vine or whatever it is that you're growing. But they've also found that they've done a lot of research on supplements, right? A lot of people are thinking, well, you should take supplements. This was an interesting study in Scandinavia where they did a study on smokers and what disease do smokers get? Lung cancer, sure. So smokers and lung cancer, and what they do in these studies is they do what's called a control group and an experimental group. What do they do in the control group? Nothing, right? They just continue smoking. They don't change anything. They just watch those smokers develop lung cancer. In the experimental group, they change something. Does that make sense? But in this case, there were 3 arms to the study. There was the smoking group that they did nothing with. That was a control group. There was the smoking group that they gave foods to. And these specific foods were what we call antioxidant foods. And what they did is they gave this group of smokers carrots, oranges, nuts and whole grains, the Brazil nut, stuff like that. So they gave them supplementation in the form of food, and they watched to see them develop lung cancer or not. In the third group, they gave them the exact same amounts of ACE and selenium, but in the form of pills. So, the control group, smoking, what do you think happened? They developed lung cancer, right? Does that make sense? Sure, but we already knew that. Second group, they smoked, but then they ate these additional foods. Do you think they developed more or less lung cancer than the control group? Less, of course. Then the supplement group, they smoked. They took their supplements every day. More or less cancer? Yes, even more than the control group. They actually had to stop the study halfway because it's not ethical, right, to continue the study. If you have done any sort of, I don't know if anyone here is a scientist or has done any research, but when I do research, I have to go through what's called an IRB, which is like a board sort of review, and they look at the ethics of the study. I have to examine my data halfway or even more often if the study has to do with death, right, mortality. Because ethically, if I know something is killing you, I should what? To stop, right? I should stop trying to kill you, right? And if I know something gives you a longevity benefit, I should tell you, right? So they actually had to unblind the study. They had to unblind the study, and they told the group that was eating the vitamins, stop, right? And they told the group that wasn't eating the foods to eat carrots, eat oranges, eat Brazil nuts, things like that, because you won't die from lung cancer as often. So I'm not saying that every study shows that vitamins and supplements are bad for you, but there are some studies that show that it's actually worse than control. Now, why is that? I don't know. I'm not sure. But I think it is related to the fact that in a whole food, you have a balance. Does that make sense? You have an equal amount of the ratios of different vitamins and minerals. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example. Many women tend to supplement what mineral? Iron. Why? Because they bleed, right? So many women take iron supplements. But the problem when you take iron supplements is that your zinc absorption goes down. So then you take a zinc supplement, but then your copper absorption goes down. So it's just, everything affects everything else. Does that make sense? So if you don't have the right ratio of things, it creates an imbalance. Does that make sense? So I tell people, if you want to supplement, you can juice. But you're still missing something in juice. What are you missing? Fiber, right? So even that is technically a little bit out of balance too. So what I tell people is if you really want to supplement, you can juice, but remember, you're still missing the fiber, which of course is important as well. Number 7, it's not always what you're eating, but it's what's eating you. Have you thought about that? I think that's a big issue. I think in our denomination we place way too much emphasis on diet and not enough emphasis on what's going on in here, right? Because many of us are dealing with unresolved anger, bitterness, a lot of traumatic issues that we don't resolve from many, many years ago. And I think those do more damage to our lives than really anything else combined. Has anyone ever heard of type A personality? Type A personality. Did you know that type A personalities live shorter than other personalities? It's true, it's proven. They actually have a mortality risk for type A personality. And what are the features of type A personality? What are the features of type A personality? And so they're busy, okay? So they're, what would you call that? Competitive? I don't know if it would be competitive, maybe assertive. How about assertive? What else? What? Passive? No, they're not passive at all. Driven, yes. What else? Angry. What else? Punctual, on time, right? That's very much. They're punctual. What else? This is just, I'm not saying these are right or wrong, I'm just saying what is type A personality? Always on the go, maybe. Never stops. Anything else? Goal-oriented, yes. And what about when others don't come up to the grade? They're intolerant of others. But you know what's very interesting is they did several follow-up studies on each of these individual traits to see, were all of them bad? Were some of them bad? Or what parts of them were creating the mortality risk for the type A's? Did you know that only 2 of those up there were responsible for the increased risk of death? Which ones do you think they were? Just 2 of them. Anger was one, yes. Intolerance was the other one. Very good. All the rest of those are fine. Being busy, being on time, being organized, getting a lot done, that doesn't hurt you. Work does not hurt you, right? Doing a lot of work does not hurt you. Getting angry, it hurts you. In fact, not only does it hurt you, did you know if you're angry for just a few seconds, that your risk of fatal heart attack goes up 300% for many hours after that? Just for a few seconds. It's not good for us to have those emotions, isn't it? Now, it's okay for you to be on time or a perfectionist or a high achiever, but what happens when others don't make the grade? If you're intolerant of them, you will die prematurely. You can't do that, right? It's like all the things I needed to learn in life, I learned in kindergarten, right? Have you heard of that? Be nice to others, don't hit others, play well, share, things like that, right? So those two traits of the type A are the things you want to watch out for, is the anger and intolerance of others, or hostility was actually what they listed it as in the literature. Those things will cause you to die prematurely. And I don't think type A is necessarily bad. I have some type A too. When I'm at work, I'm very, very type A. When I'm out of work, I'm not really type, I'm more type B, I guess, or something like that. But if you are type A, you have to really watch those two traits, because if you indulge in those, you will die prematurely. And those will hurt you more than it hurts any other person. Number 8, they said in the article, live like a Seventh-day Adventist, but I'm going to change that to just be a Seventh-day Adventist. That's okay. Everyone can be a Seventh-day Adventist and enjoy the benefits. The average North American population lives to 79. The average Adventist North American lives 89. 10 years longer? Do you think that gets the notice of the scientific community? Oh, absolutely. Remember, Okinawans only live 3 years longer than the average American, and that is studied. But the Seventh-day Adventist Health Study has funding from the NIH, lots of big organizations forever. They have perpetual funding to do this, because 10 years longer? What in the world are you guys doing? That's what the scientific community wants to know, and they want to figure out how to get that benefit for themselves. But of course, that benefit is open to everybody, right? It's not just exclusive to Seventh-day Adventists, but we want to share our health message with others so that they can enjoy the benefit. And that's why we're going to do the cookery demo. That's why we're doing health lectures, right? Number 9, be a creature of habit. So when you go to sleep, when you wake up, when you exercise, and when you eat all at the same times, that's very, very good for your body. It helps not only your circadian rhythm, but it helps your digestion, your physiology. Have you ever noticed that when you skip a meal, you're really hungry, but then after a while, you're just not hungry anymore? Because your body said, okay, I'm not going to get a meal, I'm just shutting everything down right now. So don't do that to your body. That's very, very harmful. Try to stay on a regular schedule. Number 10, you want to stay connected. Not only to your immediate family, but your friends too. But they have found that people who maintain their connections with others, like the Moai, do you remember that? Like 3 days a week, they actually live longer. In fact, there was a study that showed that you had less depression if you kept up a good relationship with your sister. Isn't that interesting? Now, why it didn't work out for brothers, I don't know. Maybe brothers just aren't as empathetic, or I don't know, they don't listen very well, I don't know. But be nice to your sister, because she'll be nice to you and she'll help you live longer. Number 11, there's a recent study that was done. The largest prospective study in the history of mankind was an 80-year prospective study. They followed children until they died, basically, and they isolated what was the character trait that made you live longer. And that character trait is conscientiousness. I find that very intriguing, don't you? Conscientiousness is almost a moral trait, right? A lot of people tried to say in the book where they examined this study, well, they were conscientious to keep their doctor's appointments. But you know what? I would not give myself that much credit. I think the conscientiousness involved doing something, following through. Not taking the shortcuts, right? But doing it properly. People that were conscientious lived longer. So, let's kind of summarize. We've got 3 secular publications all kind of saying the same things. But I want you to understand, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. You know, I'm very freely biased, and I admit that. I am biased as an Adventist, but you know what? Why not? Who doesn't want to live 10 years longer, right? I would become an Adventist just for the 10 years if I wasn't an Adventist before. But I want you to hear now from the article authors themselves. I'm going to play an interview with the photographer from National Geographic, and he's going to kind of give you his take on what he experienced in this assignment. Now remember, he's not Adventist, he's not Christian, he has nothing to do with any conflict of interest.
When you're old and gray, I love you just like today, and every star that shines is there for you. But we've got to go. There's just one thing you should know. Everything you are means something to me.
My name is David McLean, and I traveled to 3 different cultures of longevity, which are Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, Italy, and Loma Linda, California. So we went and spent time in each of these places and tried to learn about their cultures of longevity and exactly what it is they're doing to live vital and healthy lives well into their hundreds. The first longevity hotspot we traveled to was Sardinia, Italy. So in this region, men are living as long as women, which is just an incredible phenomenon. Science isn't exactly quite sure why, but one of the theories is that it's because the women wear the pants and that men have less stress as a result. But also the Sardinians have a fanatical zeal for the family. And we dropped by 4 generations of one family, and every weekend they shared this giant meal. And this social component of longevity is incredibly important. And at the time, I remember thinking, this is what being alive and having a family is all about. But the cultures of longevity in Sardinia are rapidly disappearing, and the root of them are a move away from traditional natural food in conjunction with a sedentary lifestyle. We spent time with a woman who was almost 100 and her great-granddaughter, and later that day we saw that same great-granddaughter eating potato chips, and we wondered, will she live as long as her great-grandmother? Okinawa is an archipelago in the far south of Japan, and it's home to the longest-lived people on Earth. And we met numerous people who were into their hundreds, who were leading active and very healthy lifestyles. You know, the 90-year-olds were biking and fishing 8 miles offshore with these old diving techniques on the reef. And we met an amazing woman who was over 100. Her name was Kamada, and she had been in a moai. The rough translation is that it's a group of friends who go through life together and help each other. And the energy and vitality that they would get from that, I believe, factored into the longevity equation as well. And the Okinawans have this wonderful word. It's called ikigai, and it translates roughly into the reason for which you wake up in the morning. And all of these centenarians had ikigai, and I don't think it's an accident that that's part of the reason that they're living so long. So one of the cornerstones of Okinawan longevity is caloric restriction. Yet, interestingly, they're eating a lot of food. The trick is that the food that they're eating is all low in caloric density. And that food included these beautiful miso soups that were filled with carrots, seaweed, onions, and potatoes. And like the Sardinians, the Okinawans grew most of the food themselves in their gardens, and they would go to the store for very little. But Okinawa is losing its longevity edge. Okinawa has the highest rate of obesity in all of Japan, and it was quite shocking and somewhat disturbing to see this culture of longevity disappearing right before our eyes. By far the most surprising fact that I took away from this story is that Seventh-day Adventists outlive their American counterparts by about 10 years. What are they doing? Quite simply, the Seventh-day Adventists, who largely populate Loma Linda, California, have a religion that reinforces positive, healthy behaviors. For example, if you're a devout Seventh-day Adventist, you are a vegetarian, non-smoker, non-drinker, who takes a Sabbath every Saturday, where for one whole day you have to just unplug. So we met many incredible people there. The most incredible by far was a woman named Marge Jatan, who had just turned 100 and renewed her driver's license. So we went for a cruise, but before we did that, we had to go through a morning routine where she lifts weights and rides a stationary bike. And interestingly, the Seventh-day Adventists are the only culture of longevity that we visited who are not losing their longevity edge. And I photographed a baptism at this church. And I remember thinking, wow, this is the perfect example of how this religion is still growing and carrying forward. I think in America we tend to marginalize old people, kind of put them away in retirement homes. But these amazing people in 3 different cultures represent the potential to see your great-grandchildren grow up, a potential to be healthy and happy well into your older years. And that to me was the biggest thing I walked away with from this assignment, was that, wow, I now have this sense of responsibility and control based on choices that I make. I'd read that genetics only account for about 30% of how long you live. So, the majority of how long you live is up to your lifestyle. It's up to you.
So I encourage you, take advantage of our health message. We don't have time for questions and answers, but if you want to ask me questions and answers afterwards, I would be happy to do that. Let's kneel for prayer. Loving Father in heaven, we thank you for the blessing of health that you've given us. But certainly, Lord, it is not because we are somehow better than any other people on the earth. You have given us precious light to follow, Lord. And anyone who follows that light will gain your blessing. Because certainly, Lord, you make your sun to rise on the evil and the good and send rain on the just and on the unjust. Lord, help us to share the knowledge that we have. Help us to share the principles that we have. But most of all, Lord, help us to follow the life that we have, that we might enjoy not only life, but life more abundantly, and be a good witness, so that people will come up to us and ask us and say, how do you look so young? How are you so healthy? Why are you so happy? How do you have so much energy and get so much done? Can you tell me what you're doing? So that we can introduce them not only to our health message, but to God who has given us the health message. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.